So welcome to Local Stories. I think this is maybe the sixth or seventh episode that we've done this year, and the aim of the programme has been to tell the story of local people and places. We've really enjoyed them. They've been brilliant. We've had lots of good feedback from people and offers to the collection and all sorts of things from the sessions, and we're hoping that today will be the same. And many of you might know that this week is Refugee Week, so we decided to focus this week's session on stories of refugees, people who've spent time here and done all sorts of things for our local community. There were lots of stories that we could feature, and we did have some thoughts initially about what we were going to do, but we realised it would actually be really powerful to ask local people to talk about their own experiences. So today's session will feature 3 people who have either researched the stories of people who are refugees or have experiences of that within their own family, or who spent time with refugees. So we've got 3 speakers. There are some other topics we were going to cover, and I'll talk about them a little bit at the end because we're going to look at some of those later on in the year. We're going to start off I'm going to hand over to Alison, and she is going to introduce our first speaker. So each person is going to talk for a little while, and then you'll have the opportunity. I think they're all really happy to be asked questions, so you'll be able to ask questions at the end. But if you have a burning question in between, you can post something in the chat, and the chat functions at the bottom of your screen. So Alison, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you. Hello everyone, and thank you for joining us on this gorgeous day and not lying in your garden instead. I'm going to introduce Neil. Neil Rees is from Chesham, and we've both been putting articles together for the Buxton Press. Neil covers Chesham and I cover Amersham. So Neil's a local historian and writer who's written several books on local history and dozens of articles for the Buxton Press. He lives in Chesham with his wife and 4 lovely daughters. So if there's any background noise at Neil's house, bear with him, as obviously they're all arriving from school shortly. And he's going to talk to us today about the Czech government in exile in Wingrave. And I'll hand over to Neil.
Thank you very much. Great stuff. Well, I've got a talk that I give to lots of groups. It's about 45 minutes long, but I've cut it right down. And if you're really interested, then I can tell you more another time. So I'm going to do a share screen. Let's see if this works. If you all shout, if you can see what it looks like. I'm going to tell you the story of the Czechoslovak community in Bucks during World War II. And there's only really one remnant kind of memorial to it, and it's this bus shelter. Now, it's not in the Amersham area. It's just outside Aylesbury if you take the road to Wing. And there's a Grade 2 listed bus shelter there, and I'll tell you about that later. But if we look at this picture of how Europe looked before the Second World War broke out, that pink area is Czechoslovakia. And you can see how it was sandwiched by Germany, and even more so when Germany took over Austria. So you can see it's almost sandwiched by it there. And Czechoslovakia, you can see its flag there, and it consists of Bohemia, Moravia and Slovakia. So Bohemia and Moravia is now the Czech Republic, and Slovakia is now separate. But that's what Czechoslovakia was, and Prague, the capital. If you've ever been to Prague, it's just wonderful. War there began in 2 stages. First, with the German annexation of Sudetenland in October 38, and then 1st of March 39, the Nazis walked into Prague and took over the rest of the country. This is before the invasion of Poland, when we date the Second World War from. For them, the war began then, and from the annexation of Sudetenland, refugees started coming to Britain. So the president was President Benesch. He came to England with a lot of other people who were either in England already or stayed in England or came to England. And he formed a government in exile. Part of it was some of the original government that got out and some other people. And there was about 20,000 Czechoslovaks who managed to get to Britain. Their stories are all amazing. Some came through Poland, some came through France, some came through the Middle East, all sorts of routes. And these photographs there are images of things which I've belonged to people I interviewed, and I've copied them. And so this is the main places where they're living. So you can see on this map, I haven't got quite Amersham on it, it's just off the bottom, okay? But the main places where they lived are actually in North Bucks and over into Bedfordshire. So I've circled the places there. So Aston Abbotts is where the president lived. Wingrave is where some of the government exile lived. Addington is another safe house. And Hotcliffe is where they had a military intelligence radio station working with the resistance. So it all began with friendship through the Rothschilds, and the Rothschilds were in the Wadden Chase hunt, and the master of the hunt was Harold Morton, and the keeper of the hounds was Evelyn, Countess of Essex, and they both rented their homes to the government in exile, and they moved in November 1940. So this is where the president lived. So at the top is pictures from the war, and at the bottom are pictures I took just fairly recently. So you can see it's not actually changed very much at all. You know, you can see the gates are still there, the house is still much the same, just the ivy's, a lot of the ivy's gone, but still looks much the same. And another house in Wingrave, it wasn't where the government in exile lived, as you might read in some places, but it was the president had at his house in Aston Abbotts, he had his own household staff, like his cook and his butler and his doctor and a teacher and people like that. And then his political staff, like his secretary, lived at this house in Wingrave, whereas the government in exile was actually in London. And this is another safe house. Addington is up near Winslow in North Bucks. And here lived the families of the heads of the military intelligence services. And so they were working with the British intelligence services and Special Operations Executive. They were in London, but their families lived at this safe house. And they all often used to travel over to Aston Abbotts. This is the president, President Benesch. That's at Aston Abbotts. And when I was in a second-hand bookshop in Prague once, I found this booklet written by Edward Taborski, and he was President Benesch's secretary, and he wrote memoirs of being his secretary, which is amazing because when I translated that from Czech to English, there's first-hand stories there of being at Aston Abbotts in the war. Another person who's famous, particularly if you're Czech anyway, a man called Jan Masaryk, and he had been the Czech ambassador to London before the war, so was already in the country, and he was nominated foreign minister, and he had lived in England a long time, was fluent in English. He was the one that was friends with the Rothschilds, had good connections, and was a brilliant spokesman, and used to broadcast on the BBC every week. And Vola London is like London Calling in Czech, and all his speeches were published in a book, which was a bestseller after the war. And he was a frequent visitor. He lived in London, but he often stayed at Wingrave and visited Aston Abbotts. And President Benesch was guarded by a group of soldiers, Czechoslovak soldiers, and they lived in Nissen huts. You can see one in the bottom left and how it looks today in the top right. And the numbers varied actually, but there was usually about 24, but the numbers did fluctuate. At the end of the war, a letter was published in the Bucks Herald, and I think this is worth looking at. So I've typed it out because it's hard to read in the print. But it's written by Josef Podhora. So he's one of the, I think he might be that man standing at the front, I'm not sure, but he was head of the Czechoslovak forces based in Bucks. And he wrote, "It's now 4 years since I arrived in this part of the country to take over the command of a Czechoslovak unit in your district. I've lived amongst you, together with the Czechoslovak soldiers, as the best friends, and you've always been kind and ready to help us in everything. I shall be leaving this friendly and hospitable county of yours in a few days' time, and I therefore take this opportunity of saying goodbye and of thanking you for your friendship and the kindness that I've always met with. Not only do I thank those with whom I came in close contact, but I also thank those I used to meet on trains, buses, or shops on different occasions. I do not know their names, I not even remember what they look like, but I shall always remember the friendly way they treated me. I shall always think of you with sincere gratitude, and on return to our liberated country, a return which I anticipate shortly, I will tell countrymen about your beautiful land and the good friends that I have found and made over here. I pray that every one of you will be richly rewarded for all your grief and the sufferings which you have undergone in this great struggle for freedom. And I assure you that I'm taking back with us to our country the loveliest possible memories. So I think that was in the Bucks Herald, to thank the people of Bucks, which I think is a really nice thing to say. At the end of the war, Benesh and a lot of his political entourage flew to Moscow in March 45 for discussions with Stalin, and in fact he came into Czechoslovakia with the Red Army, but a lot of them were flown home in May 45 by the RAF, and that's when most Czechoslovak community left, and the country was liberated from one end by the Americans and the other end by the Red Army. And Benesh was re-elected, and all the people who'd been in Bucks went home, had a hero's welcome, and were really happy to be back for a few years. And about 600 Czechoslovaks, this is not Bucks, this is the whole of the country, married British women, and there were weddings in Bucks and Beds. I know about, I'm trying to find them all, but there were a number of people that married English women from the local area. But the dream ended in 1948 when Jan Masaryk was found dead, having fallen out of a window in Prague, probably pushed. And that hit international news, and it's one reason why a lot of people have heard of him. And Benesh was a bit of a workaholic and died of a heart attack, probably as a consequence of Masaryk's death. And they were the two pro-British, pro-democracy leaders. And with them dead, the communists took over in 48. And all those people that went home heroes suddenly became themselves enemies overnight, under suspicion, arrested, some were killed, and as many as possible tried to come back to Britain. So in 1948, we had another wave of Czechoslovak refugees. And then in the 60s, they tried to ease off on the communism, and the President Dubček, he had the Prague Spring, and the Soviets were so worried about it that they invaded Czechoslovakia, even though Czechoslovakia was a member of the Warsaw Pact. The other Warsaw Pact countries invaded it to make sure it didn't leave. And so there was another wave of refugees in 68. So 38, 48, 68 when they came. And the Czech joke is that when a year ends in 8, they're always worried that something dramatic is going to happen. 1989, communism ended. 1991, the last Soviet troops left. 1993, the country split into the Czech and Slovak republics. So they're two countries now. And so this is the area where they lived in Bucks. And between Wingrave and Aston Abbots is this bus shelter that I told you about right at the beginning, that President Benesh paid for, and is really the only memorial to them being here. And there's a plaque on there now which says, this bus shelter was donated by President Benesh of Czechoslovakia to thank the people of Aston Abbots and Wingrave, whilst he and his cabinet were in exile here during the Second World War. And I wrote a book about it, which is sadly sold out. I've got a couple of copies actually, if you really want one, and I think the museum might have a few copies, I'm not sure. And it was translated into Czech, and it's probably the only Buckinghamshire local history book ever to be translated into Czech. I'm fairly sure of that. Now, I've just been through that really quickly. I normally can take 45 minutes to an hour to tell that story. But anyway, that gives you a start, doesn't it? Have I ended the slideshow? Am I back there?
Yeah, no, I had the same
That's the
problem.
quickest I've ever done that talk.
Are there any questions for Neil, or do you want to do questions for everyone at the end, Emily? Or
I do now. Yeah, if you're able to do that, Alison, and then we'll be.
Brilliant. Neil, can you remind me? I know from our emigrant artist, Mary Doris did a bust of one of them. Was it Masrick or Benish? I can't remember.
Oh yeah, that's right. So there was a sculptress who a Czech sculptress, and she came to Amersham and ended up living at Wendover Dean, just this side of Wendover, and she made busts of many people actually. And after she died, a relative came to collect them and left one, which was a bust of Jan Masrick, which is now we've arranged just a few years ago to be in the residence of the Czech ambassador in London. But she had an exhibition of her work done in the Czech Republic a few years ago. Mary Doris, she's called.
Neil, can I ask a question?
Yes.
The houses that you mentioned in the Abbey, in Aston Abbots and the other houses, are they all privately owned now, or are they owned by trusts or any Czechoslovakian connection now?
Yeah, no, they're all privately owned. And so the manor at Wingrave is now divided into flats. I happen to be friends with one of the people that lives in one of those flats. And from time to time, you know, if there's a new ambassador or they got someone important over from Czechoslovakia who wants to visit, I can contact him and he rings up the other household members to see which rooms we can go in. We do little tours. And we've been trying to get a plaque on the house for that.
Yeah.
Aston Abbots recently sold about a year ago to a Lithuanian businessman who's really interested in the Czech connection because he's from Eastern Europe. And so he's been doing that up, and it's not open to private visitors, but he's open to having the, you know, people like the ambassador go and visit.
Yeah, thank you.
As Ernest got his hand up.
Yes. Is it true that when they came, any children in the party were told that they were Catholics, and that's what they were to say to anybody?
Well, that's what my friend.
Yes and no. No, I mean, many of them were Catholics, so they would have been told to say they were Catholics because that would be true. The only issue was with the Jews. So, you know, a minority of Czechoslovak people were Jewish, you know, higher then than now. You know, they were not 100% sure which way the war was going to go. So even in Britain, some of them hid their Jewishness. Not all of them did, some of them didn't, but some of them hid their Jewishness. And so maybe it's a story I told you, Ernest, I can't remember, but I've got a friend, she grew up in Britain and her parents took her to church and told her she was Catholic. And then she later found out that they were actually Jewish. And it was to kind of, she then became a really staunch, proper Catholic, fell in love with a priest, and he left the priesthood, and they got married and they've got umpteen children now. So she actually became a proper Catholic. And then when she discovered she was Jewish, she said, well, I'm a Catholic by belief anyway now. But anyway, so in some cases that happened, but I know it didn't happen in all cases. But at Aston Abbots, I was fortunate enough to meet one of the soldiers that had guarded Benish when he was in his late 80s, and he wasn't very well, but I said I'd really like to meet him. So I went to meet him, and he was Jewish, and he told me that there was a monthly military service at the parish church, and they were told that if you're Jewish, you were free not to go. But he said they all did. Because he said they didn't want to miss out or be labelled as Jewish if people didn't know that they were. He said he was quite open about being Jewish, but he was also didn't mind about going to an Anglican service either. So I think my feeling is a lot of the Czech Jews were not particularly Orthodox anyway. They were quite, you know, nominal. So. But that didn't matter to the Nazis, of course.
Absolutely. Neil, one last thing I've just thought of. You did say you're looking at creating a permanent memorial. Can you just tell us a bit more about that?
Yes, yeah. So I got contacted by the parish council at Aston Abbots, and they wanted to put a information plaque in the village to tell people about the village. And they asked me, do you think the embassy will pay for it? And I contacted the embassy, and they said, well, we wouldn't pay for a plaque like just a village plaque, but if it was about the Czechs, you know, then contact the Veterans Association, because they were putting a series of plaques around the country for places where the Czechs were in the war. And they said, oh yeah, we'll pay for it as long as it's just about us. So I went back to the parish council and said they will pay for a plaque, an information board, if it's just about them. And they said, fine. So we've now written it. It's being translated into Czech. It's going to be erected on the village green, and it's going to be in English, Czech and Slovak. Hopefully will be unveiled by the 2 ambassadors at the end of July, although of course these things might change now with COVID, but that's the plan. So hopefully there will be a little memorial, a proper memorial.
That's good.
Thank you, Neil. That was thank you for being quick. It was really fascinating. You covered a lot, and it's great to finish by hearing about the plaque too. So we'll look out for that, and really well done to all your efforts to.
I should say, because I didn't, I said there were Czech refugees in Amersham and Chesham, but I mean that's who'd come individually, and so there were a few, and not many, but there were a few in our area, and there was quite a lot in Beaconsfield too, and some in Berkhamsted. So there may well be people in this area. Well, there are people in this area with Czech heritage who maybe you're not aware of or don't publicise it.
No, well, we certainly love to, hear from people if they are. We're going to move on now to our next speaker, which is Ernest Newhouse. So some of you, I'm sure you know him already.
Hi.
For me, he's been a tremendous supporter of the museum in so many ways, but he does all sorts of other things in the community too. So he is well known and Superman, and he's going to tell us a little bit about his family story.
There, right. Okay, right, well, there's a story of my family, and it's really a story of refugees from Hitler. And I thought the place to start is with the only photo I could find of my grandfather on my mother's side, whom you see here. He was a distinguished banker. He was a director of Deutsche Bank, and very well off, very well connected, and had a wonderful time until 1933, when Hitler came to power and it all fell to bits. I don't know an awful lot about the family history, I'm afraid, because when I was growing up, it wasn't so much talked about, and by the time I was interested in it, it was rather too late and all the players had departed. But the gist of what I can get is this. They moved, they could see which way the wind was blowing quite early on, and they moved, and they eventually settled in France, and they thought France would be safe. And they moved somewhere in the vicinity of Alençon in Normandy, the northern part of France. It wasn't safe because when France was occupied and part of it was free and part of it was Vichy, and they were in the wrong part, his wife, my grandmother, who was rather younger than he was, she was taken and she died in Auschwitz. But he was too old to be of interest, and so they left him alone. And so he survived, and in the end died at a ripe old age, long enough that I knew him very slightly because we didn't have much contact. He lived in France, in Nice, went over for a couple of holidays, and I met him, but he really didn't mean a great deal to me. But anyway, so that was him. And on the other side, my father's father was this man. It's not a very good photo, I'm afraid, but this is him, I think, in around 1910. And this is his wife, my grandmother, who looks a fairly fierce lady, I must say. They came from the Hanover area, but I think they must have had time in Berlin, because my father, I'm pretty certain, knew my mother, who lived in Berlin at the time, before it all went wrong, and they knew each other before they came to England. Anyway, this is grandmother, and this, the best photo I can manage, I'm afraid, is my grandfather, and this is taken in Wembley Park, where I was really brought up after the war. And the little boy looking adoringly, holding his hand, is not, I'm afraid, me, I don't think. Almost certainly not, but it would be my younger brother. And in the background, very fuzzy, no great interest for this story, is actually my uncle, my father's brother. So those are the characters. This is my grandmother, somewhat older, as I knew her. And so we come to my parents. I think this photo was taken at my wedding, but I sort of cut out just the relevant part of it. I know my mother was in England, and she must have come to England pretty early on. She'd been a student at Heidelberg, and she rowed for Heidelberg for a year. And rowing there seemed to be not a matter of getting first past the post, as it is anywhere else, but it was a matter of style. And the prize went to the most elegant, most stylish rowers, rather than the fastest. But after a year, it all went wrong, 1933, and so on and so forth. At that time, she would have been 21 or so. So her university education was disrupted. She came to England, and she worked for a while as an au pair in Tiverton to a lady who was quite formal, apparently, Mrs. Dorothy French. 2 small F's, French, if you please. Anyway, in England, my parents married. They lived initially in Belsize in London. There's quite a community in the London area. And then eventually bought a house in Wembley Park, which was really the first place that I knew. Although when the war broke out, I was only sort of just over 2, so I have no particular wartime recollections. Now, you would probably have heard that Churchill rounded up all the German refugees. He was asked the question, what do we do with all these German refugees in England when the war started? And he answered very tersely, round them all up. And so they were all rounded up. My father was sent, I think, to the Isle of Man, where there's an internment camp, and the younger brother, whom you saw fuzzily in the earlier photo, was sent to Canada. However, after a while, they thought that was not a good idea. And all these people, instead of being kept behind bars wherever out of the way, should be put to good use. So they were drafted into the army, and he went into the Pioneer Corps. Now, the Pioneer Corps were people who did all the sort of grunt work. They dug ditches, they dug latrines, they dug trenches and all that sort of thing, but all in this country. So that lasted a certain time. And then again, they thought there's some good talent out there, we should make use of it. And he found himself in REME, the Royal Army Engineering and Mechanical Unit. And there, as far as I can tell, he managed, or was partly responsible for managing a REME works establishment. He wasn't a technical man at all, but he did know about organizing things, and that happened, and he was obviously quite good at it. And then the next twist of the story was that they started the listening. You probably know about the listening, Latimer Park and all that. And he was one of the people who was drafted into that, and he was one of the listeners. We've heard a lot about the listeners here, so I won't go into all of that. My uncle, aforesaid, said that he reckoned my father was also in Bletchley, but I can't vouch for that. I've got no records of it. And unfortunately, he died in early 1970, which was before the ban on talking about Bletchley and that sort of thing was lifted. So he never spoke about it, because if he was at Bletchley, they were all very good. And as Churchill very nicely put it, that was the goose that laid the golden eggs, but didn't cackle. He did talk a little bit about the work at Bletchley, but nothing very significant. My mother was one of 4 siblings, and when they left Germany, the other 3 all went to America. Quite why it worked out that way, again, I don't know. So I've got quite a good American establishment and a family whom I see occasionally, but regrettably not very often. My grandfather on the other side, the elderly gentleman you saw earlier on with a little boy, he had a nice little business going. He was after the war, certainly, he was importing Hummel figures. And those are the rather nice porcelain figures. I'll show you one afterwards when I get up, and I just finished the chat because there's one on the mantelpiece just by me. And he was the agent for a gentleman in Germany with the unfortunate name of Goebbels, who had the factory where they made these things, and it was a nice, good import-export business going. The name of the company was named after my father, well, I don't know why, but when I was old enough to take an interest in these things and needed to wind up affairs, and I looked into the affairs of the company, it had no assets whatsoever, so it had all actually been closed down. So, what was I doing? Well, when the war started, our house was requisitioned by the army, and Women's Royal Army Corps some of them were stationed there. And my mother and I went to Kendal, right up in the Lake District. And that was well out of the way of any enemy action. So I saw next to nothing of the war going on. Towards the end of the war, when I was aged 7, war was coming to the end. My education had been rather complicated, going from this school to that school. And I finished up in a boarding school in Ambleside at the age of 7. And that was all right. And people have asked me, well, was it horrible? Did you hate it or whatever? And I can only say that sort of after I'd been there a year and it was Easter, by then the war had ended. My parents had moved back into the house in Wembley Park. And I was asked, did I want to come back to London or did I want to stay another term at the boarding school? And I opted to stay another term at the boarding school. So it can't all have been horrid. Otherwise I wanted to get away as fast as possible. And after, the only other thing I want to say really is that various people have asked me, well, did your parents talk German at home? And were you brought up speaking German? And the answer is no, because in the formative years, I was in Kendal with my mother. And Kendal is a small little country town away from all these things. So that the last thing that she could be heard to be doing would be walking around the town talking in the language of the enemy. So obviously she didn't talk to me in German. And so I knew no more German than any other boy of my sort of age and education. So lost chance, as it were. Although I have managed to catch up on it somewhat later. So that, in a rather fast nutshell, is roughly the story of my family. I had a nice little story, but I don't know, which is peripheral to this, but have I got a couple of minutes, Emily, or?
Yes, you have. Yeah, do you want to stop sharing and then we can see you full screen? But yes, yeah, no, you've definitely got time, and then we'll have a couple of questions.
Right, so I've tried to stop sharing. Right. Stop sharing, that's it. There we are. Okay, can you see me? Yes.
Yes, yeah.
Good, good, good. Okay. My later career took me into the BBC, as some of you will know. And part of my patch, because I worked in the World Service, part of my patch was BBC monitoring, which was established to listen to all foreign broadcasters, or lots of foreign broadcasters. And it really had 2 clients. One client was the BBC news gathering operation, which speaks for itself, but it also served as an information channel into the Foreign Office. And every day, a publication landed on the desks in the Foreign Office called Summary of World Broadcasts, which included everything that had been said by anybody that they knew about up to 3 o'clock on the previous day. Well, the roots of the monitoring service, again, were in the wartime. when the government of the day thought it would be a good thing to know what German broadcasters were saying to their own people. And so they took some of the refugees, again, out of the internment camps and so on. And they went to a place in Oxfordshire that the BBC had anyway, and they set up a listening service of German stations and again fed the product to the government. Okay, move on into my own time, 1990, give or take a bit. And the monitoring service by then was established in Caversham, which is near Reading. And they had to expand as a big new building went up. And eventually the building was finished, and there was a big party to mark the opening of the new building. And they invited a whole lot of these old boys. And some of them were names that we knew about. There was Gombrich, who wrote The History of Art, and oh dear, I can't remember now. A well-known publisher, whose name just escaped me, was one of them. Anyway, a whole lot of these people gathered around, and there was I, as a BBC monitoring manager, with a cup of tea in my hand and making small talk and wondering, what do I say? So I was talking to them, and I said, did you always work in Caversham, or were you in Wood Norton, which was their place up in Warwickshire? And did I hit gold? Because it turned out that what had happened was that they had been up in Warwickshire, and then the BBC got worried about what was then called the Home Service, which was broadcasting out of London. And London was not a good place to be, for obvious reasons. So they wanted to move the Home Service out, which meant kicking these nuisance people who were in Warwick, in Worcestershire, somewhere else. So they were all moved down to Caversham. And in the best tradition of management all around the place, the move had been mishandled, and they felt they had been badly treated. Now, this was 1990, and the move in question must have been the thick end of 50 years earlier. But all these old men were still angry about the way they had been treated. And as soon as I asked the question, the whole story came pouring out, and they were hopping mad and relived all their frustrations and bubbled away. And I have to say, I went home on air. It was absolutely wonderful. So a different aspect of what some of the refugees did during the works, as well as the listening. They listened to the government services, the German service as well, for different reasons. Okay, that's about it. I don't know if I'll take questions. I'm not sure I can answer any of them, but for what it's worth.
Well, I've got one to start with, which you did touch on a little bit, which was, you know, if your father wasn't there, what it was like for your mother. You know, it must have been a really challenging time if she was on her own in a foreign country.
I'm sure it was, but bear in mind, my age at the time was sort of between 3 and 7, more or less. So I was not very perceptive about these matters. That was life. You took life as it came, and you didn't know any better. We lived in a small rented house in Kendal, which I can still remember, but seemed to be comfortable. You know, I was fed, I was watered, I had a few toys. I remember one year at Christmas, I had a train set. The train set consisted of a set of rails, 1 point, a tender, and 2 trucks, or 2 passenger cars, I can't remember. Didn't have an engine, but never mind. I played very happily with that for quite a long time. But you know, small children adapt to whatever's going.
Mm. Yes. Would anyone else like to ask Ernest a question?
Ernest, hi.
Hi, sorry, who was that? Oh, Peter, yes.
Sorry, hi. Just who in the family anglicised the name?
That's interesting. It was certainly, well, it was only on my mother's side, because the other girls married in America and took names of their husbands. I always thought my father did it early on, and then I discovered that actually it only happened after the war that the name was anglicised. But as far as I was concerned, I have always been Newhouse. I've never known anything else.
Your birth certificate then would have been in your father's original name, would it?
Yes, yeah.
Has that caused you problems at all?
No, not at all. Just out of curiosity, may I ask if you remember the name of the boarding school in Ambleside? It's just that I grew up there, so.
Oh, yes, I do indeed. I remember it vividly. King's School.
Ah, King's School. I wondered if it was that. Thank you.
Yes, yes. Every Sunday we were marched down in crocodile, a fairly long walk into the centre of town and taken into church.
Yes.
Sat on the side, and I got very bored, but I did know all about the tables for determining Easter and so on, which was all that I had to read in the sort of front of the Book of Common Prayer.
Oh, brilliant.
Margaret has a question here.
Did you always speak English at home?
Well, yes, for the reason I said, that we couldn't be brought up speaking German in a small town in the middle of a war. Alison.
Ernest, what happened to your brother in Canada?
Oh, I think he spent the war there and then he came back. But then we came back to London and then I got to know him, but I obviously didn't know him during the war. But he must have had an education on the way around. No, he wouldn't have needed an education. Sorry, it wasn't my brother, it was my father's brother who was in Canada.
Oh, sorry, your uncle.
Yes, yeah, my uncle, yeah.
Did your family sort of connect with the German community later on? You know, was the one where you grew up in?
Yes, oh yes, much of their social life was seemed to be based around people they knew, part of the same sort of refugee community. Except that interestingly, I've just recently acquired a different family history program, family tree program, and that scours all sorts of other family trees and keeps telling me that Mr. Somebody in Sweden has come up with this name and it's your fourth cousin 5 times removed, or thinks it is it the same person, you recognize the match. And through this, a whole lot of names that I always thought were friends of my family turn out to be remote cousins.
Oh, right.
There were names I knew, but I didn't realize that they were in any way family.
Oh, that's interesting.
Pity that, you know, it's far too late to explore any of these things now. Okay.
Does anyone else have a question, or shall we move on? If you do, we can perhaps ask it at the end. So
Yeah, sure.
thank you so much, Ernest. That was really generous of you to share your story with us. And
well, you're very welcome. I'm sorry, it was a bit brusque because I didn't have much notice of this, so I had to do it on the hoof, as it were. But there you are. I think I covered the points.
Yeah, and if you don't know the story of the listeners, I'll mention that again at the end for anyone who's not familiar with it. Our last speaker is Chris Vega. He was born and brought up in Amersham on the Hill, so slightly different, completely different to Ernest's experience. So he was born in 1934, so he was 5 when the war broke out and 11 when it finished. And he's going to tell us a little bit about what he remembers of his family providing a place of refuge for people who were in exile in Britain. So, Chris, if you want to unmute yourself, I'll hand over to you.
Yes, thank you, Emily. Yes, our house was, during the war, was an open house. We had a considerable number of different people coming through, servicemen, servicewomen, and various other people. And first of all, just a little deviation, because after the war, it must have been 1947-48, my father, continuing his open house policy, invited some Czech students who had been brought over by the British Council as an exchange, and they were studying in England. And the local Rotary Club found sort of local homes for them to visit just for holidays and occasional weekends and so on. And so we had 1 or 2 of these Czech students. I remember one of the first ones, he'd got his concentration camp number tattooed on his arm, on his forearm, and that made a big impression. One of the later ones, probably 1948, he was a young lad studying electrical engineering. And when that was at the time, of course, that the communists moved into into Czechoslovakia, or took over, and these lads were actually, two of them were with us at the time that this news was broken, and they were immediately in a terrible quandary. They just did not know what to do for the best. Should they go back home, or should they stay in this country and abandon their families? It really was a terrible time for them. But in fact, the ones that were with us decided they would go back, which they did. But my mother kept in touch with one of them for many years afterwards. Very, very limited contact, because letters had to be very carefully phrased, not to implicate anybody in anything. But nevertheless, I think the contact was greatly appreciated, and this lad and his wife came over as mature adults after the communists had abandoned their Czechoslovakia. And so I did meet him again many years later. It must have been about 1980. But that's really just a diversion. The story really I want to tell is of two refugees. They were German, they were Jewish, and it was a mother and a daughter. And they came over, well, they left Germany. It must have been quite late, perhaps 1938, I don't know. They managed to get into Belgium somehow. The daughter, Eva, was an art student in the middle of her course at the time, so she had to abandon that. And her mother came over not speaking very much English, into Belgium first, and then across into England. They ended up in Amersham, and they managed to find digs in a little cottage, a tiny cottage, which was one of a row of cottages in not Lexham Gardens, the Booth and Slipper Road, which joins on to Rickmansworth Road. And there was a row of cottages where the car park now is, fronting onto the pavement. No front gardens, just door pavement. And this family, the Lemons, they had 6 children already in this cottage, and somehow they managed to put up these 2 extra people. I don't know how it was done, but that's where they lived. But after a little while, my mother, who'd got 3 children and a rather large house to look after, decided she would like some domestic help. And she heard that Eva was looking for work. So that's how she came to work for my mother. After a little while, because she was having difficulty living in this tiny cottage, they moved into our house. We had a large house with a 3-story house, and the top flat, which would originally have been servants, suddenly came into its own again and accommodated the 2 of them. And Eva did domestic work for my mother in exchange for accommodation and some wages. Eva quickly learned very good English, her mother not so much so, but they were with us then for the whole of the duration of the war and became part of the family. I wonder if we could show the picture.
Yep, I'll put it up now. There we are.
This is a family group with my father in naval uniform in the front, then my brother and myself in the corner. Behind my brother is my mother, and then to her right, as you look at it, there was a girl who was working in a college in the house next door to us, a secretarial college. They had evacuated out of London to carry on the college out of the country. To the left of the group is my sister, and then in the middle at the back is Eva and her mother Elsa. Eva to the right, dark figure, and her mother Elsa. They were very much part of the family very quickly, and that's how it continued right through the war. Eva was very artistic, and although she had had to abandon her course as a student, she picked up her artistic inclinations later, and she started illustrating children's books. There was somebody in London who used to come down. I can't remember how that contact originated, but this woman came down and would bring the latest text of a children's book, and Eva would illustrate it. And she did very bright, cheerful pictures, but she also was a very good cartoonist, and she did a whole series of cartoons of family life in our house. And I'd like to just try and show a couple of those, perhaps with your help. I'm going to hold these up to the screen and hope that you can see them.
Move it back a little bit more. That's it, maybe a little bit more. That's it, yep, that's pretty good.
This is a scene in the kitchen at the house. My mother working at the table getting ready for some baking, and us children doing our piano practice in the lounge. And she's calling out, B flat, Peter, and Christo, E sharp with the left hand. She was a pianist, as you can gather, and she was definitely doing two tasks at the same time. Another one.
That's it, back a little bit more. That's it, great.
We had some pet rabbits which were always escaping, and we had a large garden, so they had plenty of places to hide, so that the household was always out trying to round up these rabbits and get them back in the hutch. So that's a little scene that she recorded there. Perhaps just one more, which does just show her style. It's just a little cartoon that she did, but this is the style she used in the illustrative work that she did, except that she coloured them very brightly. The little sort of twist at the end of the story is that towards the end of the war, she was working, volunteering in the canteen, which was in the Free Church Hall down Sycamore Hall, it was called, I think, in those days. And she used to go there at times to help out with serving the troops that came in and so on. And there, towards the end of the war, she met, it must have been just after the war, I think, she met a Polish serviceman, Jan, and Jan had come over with the army. After the war, he was demobbed in this country, and of course they were faced with the same problem that the Czech lads had. Should they go back or should they stay? And some did one thing and some did another. Jan decided to stay in this country, and he and Eva eventually married and lived very happily in Cheshire for many, many years. and we kept in touch with both of them during that time. So it was a happy story, really. But of course, the irony is that Germany and Poland have been absolute arch enemies right through the war. The Poles had suffered terribly badly, and yet this little romance managed to take off and was a success. I think that rounds up the story.
Thank you, Chris. I'm sure there'll be quite a few questions about your story, knowing it, especially for the fact that it is so local. But did you know of other families, or did your parents tell you of other families that looked after, provided a place for people to live who were refugees in the local area?
No, I don't remember hearing of any. There must have been some, I'm sure, but no, I'm sorry.
You have written down your story, haven't you, for perhaps people that, if you're willing to share it with others. I know we have a copy, but you have written it down, haven't you?
Yes, I have. Yes, yes.
Would anyone like to ask a question?
My question was, could we get your story on the website? Because it's such a fantastic story. We ought to, if you were happy with us to write it or put it on the Amersham website, the museum website. So
yes, yes.
I think that would be lovely. It's such a powerful story.
Yes. Just another little tie-up with local history is that Jan, along with many other Poles, of course, was for a long time living in Hodgemore camp. They used to come into Amersham for a little bit of rest and recreation, go to the canteen, and that's how it sort of all happened. But that's where he was living.
And that was one of the other stories we were going to cover today, but one of the people I hope we might interview, she's not very well, but part of her story is written up on our website, so I'll show that in a minute. But we have, over the last 10 years, interviewed Polish people who are still living locally about their memories of living in Hodgemore, but there's probably still a lot more that we could record and gather about that. So if there are people who would like to tell us a bit more about their stories, we'd really like to hear it. Does anyone else have a question? Ernest?
No, no, I don't want to interrupt any other questions. I've just got something else to offer at the end.
Sorry, may I ask a question, please?
Yes, Anne, yeah.
Thank you. Eva and her mother left Germany. Did they have any contact with anyone or hear what had happened to their relatives and friends who had to remain?
I don't think they had any contact from Germany, but I think Eva did have a cousin in Belgium, who she kept in touch with, and she must have been the stepping stone that brought them eventually over to England, because I presume they managed to get across the border into Belgium with some, well, obviously successfully. I don't know the story of how difficult that was, but they did manage that. And then, of course, with the war developing, Belgium suddenly was not a safe place, and they came across to England.
Go on. Anne, were you going to say something else? Sorry.
No, I just can't imagine the dislocation of having to leave your country and everything that you know, land somewhere completely unknown.
Yes, indeed. I think that's it's difficult to understand how these people managed to integrate so well, but a lot of them did. I suppose they had no option. That was all they could do. But yes, our own experience of that with these two ladies was so good. It was very much. They really did become part of the family.
Did Eva's mother remain too then? When she married and settled in Chesham, did she remain too?
Yes, she did. Yes, she lived with her daughter and her husband. Yes.
One shouldn't assume that people came to a foreign country and had no contacts whatsoever. Given that both German and Austrian Jews, for example, were coming to Britain probably from the early 1930s onwards, people arriving later would somehow have had some distant connection. And for example, if they were going to America and required visas, they had to have someone that they knew, a relative probably, stand up for them and guarantee them a home and so on and so forth. So, I mean, in my case, my father's case, for example, I assumed that he knew no one. And that was probably true, except I subsequently discovered doing family research that the firm he worked for during the war, he was actually related to one of the owners, which is how he must have got the job. So, you know, it's surprising, but there's a network, and I mean, that must go for immigrants that have come through the ages. You know, I mean, the West Indians, the Pakistanis, so on and so forth. Once a few are here, a network begins to grow, and they tend to end up in the same sort of place. I think Ernest was talking about Belsize or Belsize Square. I mean, that area was home to a very large proportion of Austrian and German refugees. In fact, apparently the joke is that the bus conductors going down Finchley Road would always refer to it, the stop, as the Finchley Straße, so that people knew where they were. But cafes there were cosmopolitan and continental. People would go in for a cup of coffee at 10 o'clock and still be there at 3 in the afternoon, not having had another cup of coffee, which is the continental way. So, yeah, so that was just the point. Clearly, it's a shock to leave your country, whether you've left voluntarily or you've been kicked out, which is what many refugees suffered. But they tended to have some connection somewhere. A lot of them did, anyway.
Talking of Belsize in the area, do you know the story about the road sign in that area, which says, that direction, Golders Green, 3 miles, but to you, 2.5.
Just one very brief little anecdote. Another sort of aspect, really, of the situation during the war. My family name came from South Africa, but was originally Dutch, probably German. During the war, I distinctly remember I was out playing in the front drive when a policeman turned up on a bicycle. He was a sergeant, and he wanted to have a word with my father. And my father came out, and I was still sort of hanging around. And he was asking him all sorts of questions. I don't remember the details of the questions, but it all centered around his name. And they were checking up on anybody with German-sounding names. My father was absolutely incandescent because he'd been in the Royal Navy during World War I, and the fact that he and his nationality should be questioned in this way made him absolutely furious. I think he managed to keep his cool while he was talking to the policeman, but afterwards we all heard his views in no uncertain terms. I think they eventually abandoned doing that, but they were obviously, in the early part of the war, were checking up on all the names at intervals. And so that was just another aspect of the refugee problem.
Probably would have had the list of names from the 1939 register, if that's the time after this check began. And obviously, they would look through and look for anything that wasn't Smith, Jones, or Malarkey.
I think my, you know, you can imagine with my surname, it wasn't dissimilar. I think for my husband's family, was the same. And it's a little bit like your story, Ernest, that my husband's grandfather was sent to the Faroe Islands, and he was a German translator there. I don't think we've ever found out exactly what he did, but he was certainly using his German heritage to translate documents. But I think they definitely had some troubles with their surname. Thank you so much, everybody who's participated today. It's been a really interesting afternoon. Ernest, you've got your hand up. Would you like to? Oh, yeah. If you unmute yourself.
Yeah, this is the sort of thing that my grandfather was importing through his London office, made their Hummel figures. And they were made in Germany. And I think this piece actually comes from the Hummel factory and was given to me as a wedding present by the proprietor of that firm. As I said, the gentleman with the unfortunate name of Goebbels.
Thank you. Thank you again. Thank you, all of you. It's been a real privilege to listen to your stories. If you're interested in finding out a little more, I think Alice and I agreed there's a lot more stories around refugee stories of the local area. We've certainly spoken to a couple of other people who'd really like to talk about their stories. So we're going to plan that hopefully for September, for the September session. And we also had some really lovely research from Brian Horridge, who I think is on the call now, looking at the story of Belgian families who were refugees in the First World War. So I hope to cover that a little bit more in that session too. But in the short term, if you're interested in finding out a bit more, I've got a few resources up on my screen to show you. Hang on one sec. So there is a website for Refugee Week overall. So if you're interested in finding out a bit more about the sort of stories from around the country. So the website URL is refugeeweek.org.uk. So you can find out a bit more there. Alison is actually representing the museum tomorrow at an event organised by Bucks County Museum. And that is a collection of people from arts organisations across the county sharing refugee stories. So Alison is going to talk a little bit about emigre artists that we've talked about before, and Mary Duras, who was mentioned by Neil, is one of them. But there's certainly someone from Bucks Archives and someone from Waddesdon Manor talking, Marlow Refugee Action. So you might like to tune into that. That's tomorrow evening at 7. If you just go to the Bucks County Museum website, you can book a free space at that. The other couple of things which have been mentioned today, there are articles on our website you might be interested in. So under the history, there's an article which is mostly extracted by the book called The Rabbi in the Green Jacket, written by Vivian and Deborah Sampson, which looks at Jewish families and Jewish connections with Amersham, which started during the war. So if you just go under history on the website, History of Amersham, and if you typed in Jewish or Rabbi, that article will probably come up. There's also another article here, which is one Alison pulled together, which looks at people who were displaced in the Second World War. So in some cases it's people evacuated out of London, but there's quite a long piece there about Hodgemore Woods and the Polish community that lived there. So you might want to look at that too. And there is another page, the lady I mentioned, Vlad, who is a member of our Reminiscence group, part of her life story is also written up on the website. She has a really fascinating story. Finally, if you want to look at previous episodes of Local Stories, if you just Google Amersham Museum YouTube and then you need to click on videos, you can see, I wish the freeze frames were better on some of these, because you end up looking like you're pulling all sorts of funny faces at the beginning. But all of the previous episodes of Local Stories are on there, and the emigre one is there, Amersham Museum's Local Stories Emigre Artist, which does connect with today. So you might want to look at that. But this episode will be up there shortly too. That's quite a lot of information, but just a few other bits to mention. Our next episode in July is looking at sport, a bit of a lighter subject, but to tie in with all the sporting events which are taking place across the country, across Europe and the world if the Olympics go ahead. So we thought that might be quite fun. I think we'll have a break in August, and then September we'll probably return with some of the stories that we haven't covered today. So thank you all for joining us. It's you know, we really enjoy these sessions, and what makes them a success really is people sharing their stories and people chipping in on the day. So thank you all of you, and we hope to see you again next time.